I told him I don't love him anymore and I want a divorce. He just smirked and said, "I'll get you back." I never imagined that my husband would ruin my life because I told him I didn't love him again and that I wanted a divorce. For the sake of privacy, I'll use fake names. My husband's name is Dave. He's 35. I'm a 30-year-old woman who has been married for 3 years. My marriage today was pretty awful. I can't remember a single day I was actually happy in the course of our marriage. I lost everything because of my stupidity. I don't know what came over me. I started cheating on my husband. I thought my husband would fall on his knees and beg me when I told him I didn't love him anymore and threatened to divorce him. But instead of begging, he divorced me. I never in my wildest imagination would have believed that the man I married 3 years ago would be capable of such a thing. To be honest, I married Dave because of his money. I met Dave through a Nath. My older friend fell head over heels with Dave, but I wasn't feeling the same way. I never wanted to marry Dave because I wasn't in love with him. My parents told me that there's more to marriage than love. They said I'd grow to love Dave over time, but that never happened. Dave is a kind, caring, and gentle man. He's a kind-hearted man, but not my type. He's short and bald, but he's very generous. That's what attracted me to him. So we got married just 4 months after dating. After the wedding, I found out that my parents had lied to me. They said love was an essential ingredient for any marriage to work, but that wasn't true. Dave is a nice guy, but I wasn't attracted to him. Anything he did irritated me more. The more he tried to make me happy, the more I distanced myself from him. Dave made sure I never lacked anything. He provided me with everything I needed. He gave me everything I needed, but it didn't move me. I wanted more. Dave wasn't a romantic guy, but he always made sure we went on a dinner date every Friday. I dreaded every Friday night because of the dinner date. I didn't want to be seen with Dave outside. I always felt ashamed. I couldn't bring myself to love Dave. I felt all alone in the marriage. My loneliness pushed me to start having an affair. It was just a year after our wedding. I started having an affair with Tom. Tom was everything I didn't think I could have in a man. He was tall, cute, and loving. He had everything I wanted in a man except he wasn't as rich as Dave. Tom was jobless, and I was even the one paying most of his bills. I fell in love with Tom the second I met him. It was love at first sight. Tom has this irresistible charm I can't explain. My affair with Tom continued over the years. Tom would always beg me to leave my husband for him. Initially, I thought that was impossible, but soon I began thinking about everything and concluded that life was too short for me. I started planning my exit from the marriage. I started saving money in Tom's account and was careful about how I handled things because I knew there was no way Dave would forgive me if he ever found out that I was cheating on him. Tom was a great catch. He always knew how to put a smile on my face. Since I started going out with Tom, I felt different. It seemed like I'd finally found my soulmate. Even though Tom wasn't rich, he still made sure he spent the little he had on me time. Time flies when we're together. Sometimes I wish it would slow down. Tom and I had a lot in common. We saw life the same way. If only I'd met Tom before I met Dave, things might have been different. Dave is a realtor. He was always away on business. That gave me time to meet with my lover Tom whenever I wanted. Sometimes he came over to the house when Dave wasn't around. Everything was going well until one day when Dave arrived unannounced. I bet it was our nosy neighbors that tipped him off. So Dave arrived in the middle of the night on one fateful day without any notice. Tom was around. I heard the doorbell ring. I was shocked because I wasn't expecting anyone. I decided to go look. I saw my husband standing outside at the front of the door. I froze for some seconds. I honestly thought I was dreaming. Dave pushed me aside and ran upstairs. It was at that point that it dawned on me that everything was real. Dave ran up and straight to our bedroom. Luckily for me, Tom had already left the room and gone to hide in the kitchen while Dave ran up to our bedroom. Tom quickly ran out from the kitchen into the living room and left the building. Here's the thing. Tom and I had always joked about this scenario countless times. In fact, we had planned what we would do in such a scenario. Tom and I had come down from the bedroom, So while I was going to check who was at the door, he went to hide in the kitchen because that was the last place anyone would go when they came visiting. While Dave was rushing upstairs, I opened the door wide for Tom to run out. That's how I escaped being caught on that day. Dave, on the other hand, felt like a fool when he came to our bedroom and didn't see anyone. He immediately weakened, like he was about to catch a thief, but he was disappointed when he met an empty room. Dave took his time moving from one room to another. He checked all the rooms, even the kitchen and bathroom. When he was done, I calmly asked him why he was searching the house so thoroughly and if he'd misplaced something. He was suddenly unable to speak. I realized that Dave had realized about my affair with Tom and that someone had told him. I decided to turn the situation around. I started crying and accused Dave of not trusting me. I called him names and told him he was insecure and projecting his insecurities onto me. Dave apologized and said he was sorry and promised me. He said he'd trust me from now on, but deep down I knew he didn't believe me. I knew him too well. At that point, I felt bad for him. Dave was a good man and didn't deserve what I was doing to him. After that experience, I decided to end my relationship with Tom and just make my marriage work. I stopped contacting Tom, but then Dave went on another business trip and somehow I found myself back with Tom. This time, I decided to be very discreet. I stopped Tom from coming over to my place. Instead, I'd go over to his place. Tom was pushing me to get a divorce from Dave and split his property so we could be together. To be honest, the idea of divorcing Dave scares me. I don't know if it's because I know I wouldn't get anything. Dave and I signed a prenup before our wedding, or the fact that things might not work out between me and Tom when he finds out I'm broke and only leaving off my husband's money. Tom asked me to choose between him and Dave. He told me that if I truly loved him as I claimed, I'd be willing to divorce Dave. What Tom doesn't know is that I might lose everything after the divorce. I haven't told Tom that Dave and I signed a prenup before our wedding. I don't think he'd take it well if he found out. I don't want to lose Tom, but on the other hand, I don't want to lose the comforts I enjoy by divorcing Dave. I'm in a tricky situation right now. I could really use some advice, guys. What do you think I should do? Should I divorce Dave and move on with Tom? Or should I end my relationship with Tom and just face my before? I'm back on Reddit to read your opinions, but I've decided to go ahead with my divorce. I'm moving on with my lover. After Dave returned from a trip, I told him I don't love him anymore and I want a divorce. He didn't say anything. He just smirked and carried on with his day. I was still trying to figure out what to do. I was curious about what was going through Dave's mind and why he was so quiet, even though I told him I didn't love him anymore and that I wanted a divorce. Dave's lawyer arrived and presented me with divorce papers when I saw him that morning. I was taken aback because we weren't expecting him, and Dave never mentioned that his lawyer was coming when he handed me the divorce papers. I asked him what the papers were for, and he told me to open them so I could see for myself. I quickly opened the papers and was surprised to see that they were divorce papers. I was shocked, to say the least. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I felt speechless. I had so many things I wanted to say, but I couldn't utter a word. Soon Dave arrived. He had gone out very early that morning. As soon as he stepped in, he started throwing my things out. At that point, I realized this wasn't a prank. I grabbed Dave and started pleading. I told him I didn't mean what I said about divorcing him and that I was only joking. That's when he started talking. He told me how he'd been suspecting me for quite some time. It'd been a while, and he'd been waiting for the right moment to send me packing. He reminded me about that day. He showed up unannounced. He said a neighbor and friend had told him that I usually bring one guy over to the house when he's not around. He told me how he pretended to go on a trip just to stay at a hotel. On that day, the neighbor called him to say my guest had arrived. That's why he stormed the house unannounced. He said even though he didn't catch the guy red, he told me he'd seen 2 glasses of wine in the bedroom and some cheap male underwear that wasn't his in the bathroom. He said he'd always known I was cheating on him and that he'd been planning his revenge. He also told me he'd installed a CCTV camera in the house and had videos of me and Tom. I was really shocked and fell to my knees. I started pleading for mercy, but he pushed me away and continued throwing my things out. I didn't know that Dave was aware of the fact that I had been cheating on him, but I decided to keep quiet. I was perplexed. I didn't know everything would generate to this level. I thought Dave would be devastated and begging me not to leave him. I didn't know he had been planning on how to divorce me for a long time. I told Dave I was going to divorce him, but he threatened to release all the unclad videos of me and Tom he had on social media. I decided to sign the divorce papers. After signing them, Dave promised to make my life a living hell. He asked me to watch and see how he was going to ruin my life. I picked up all my things and left from my parents' place. They were shocked to see me because I didn't inform them that I told my parents everything that had happened. They were disappointed in me, but that was nothing compared to how they looked at me. I could tell they wanted to disown me. They called me names and asked me to go back and ask Dave to forgive me. I told them there was no need and that I didn't even love him. I told my parents I was in love. I was seeing someone else, and maybe divorcing Dave isn't such a bad thing after all. At that point, my dad lost it and slapped me. He said he would never approve of me getting married to someone who can't even feed himself. My parents asked me to pack up my bags and that they were taking me back to Dave to plead on my behalf. I got so angry at my parents for pushing me to go back to Dave that I angrily started exchanging words with them. I told them it was their greed, that I told them I would have been fine if they hadn't pushed me into getting married to someone I didn't love. I said I wasn't going back and walked out on them the following day. Dave arrived at my parents' house. I thought he was going to beg me to come back to him and that he'd realized he couldn't leave without me. Unfortunately, Dave had other ideas. I forgot to mention that Dave was the one who bought the house my parents were living in after our wedding. He gifted my parents a house. On that day, he arrived with security and asked my parents to evacuate the house immediately. Everyone was shocked before we could say a word. The security guy had started throwing my parents' things. The only things my parents came into the house with were their clothes, because Dave furnished the house before he gifted it to my parents. I was devastated when my parents pleaded with Dave to forgive me and let them stay in the house. Unfortunately, Dave ignored them and continued with his plan. I never knew my husband could be so unkind. I thought Dave was a kind man, but he was actually the opposite. Only someone with no heart would do such a thing. He got rid of the old folks who lived in the house he'd given them. I saw my parents crying, and it broke my heart. I felt helpless. I never thought a day like this would ever come. But I bet Dave had always prepared for a day like this. The house receipt was in his name. It all makes sense now. When Dave refused to give me or my parents the house receipt, it suddenly dawned on me that I didn't marry a saint. He was always one step ahead of me. I was the fool. I joined my parents and siblings in pleading with Dave for forgiveness. But he acted like we were non-existent. He was just going through the motions, giving orders for our things to be thrown out. There was no sign of Dave showing any mercy. My parents and I picked up our belongings and headed to our old house. I felt bad for my parents, who had gone from living in a beautiful apartment to now being back to their old house that leaks whenever it rains. At that moment, it dawned on me. I realized I'd let my parents down. The divorce proceedings started, and it wasn't as I'd anticipated. The procedure was mentally draining for me. What was worse was that Dave made sure he frustrated me. He took everything he'd ever bought for me, even the engagement ring and wedding rings I was hoping to keep. He took the money to start up something new. My husband was shameless and took everything. The situation revealed who he really was. He's a monster. As time passed, it became clearer that Dave was on a mission to frustrate me. Even the joint savings account we had was cleared. I was left with nothing. Update Reddit. I'm back to give you an update on my story. I didn't expect it to get so much attention, and I never thought I'd make an update. But seeing how invested everyone is, I feel it's best to let you all know what has been going on. Soon after the divorce proceedings were over, I thought I was finally free from Dave's torture. However, I was wrong. A few days after our divorce, Dave, he still went ahead and leaked my unclad pictures on social media. I went through another hellish few days, and I couldn't even step outside. I was ashamed of myself. 3 months after everything had calmed down, I decided to go back to Tom so we could continue our relationship. But to my greatest surprise, the fool told me he was no longer interested and that he had moved on. He told me he now has a serious girlfriend. He was planning on settling down with her. At first, I thought he was pulling my legs, but soon realized he was serious. A lady arrived. Tom asked me to leave his house. He introduced me to the lady as his cousin. When I asked him about the money I was saving in his account, he told me he said it was an emergency, so he used the money. I was so shocked it was my last hope. I told Tom I wasn't leaving his house until he gave me every penny I'd saved in his account. He said he'd call the cops if I didn't leave. I wanted to create a scene, but I didn't want to get into more trouble because I was already facing a lot of challenges just as I was about to leave. Tom's girlfriend followed me out and told me how she and Tom had been dating for years. She said that Tom only used me to get some cash. I started crying. I felt used and trashed. I went home that day feeling lost and hopeless. I couldn't think straight, and I didn't know what to do. I felt betrayed by the one I loved. I loved and risked everything. At that point, it felt like the scales had fallen from my eyes. I started to regret everything. I felt bad for myself, and most importantly for my parents. If I could turn back the hands of time, I would have done things differently. Perhaps I would still be married by now if I had learned to love my husband. Maybe I would have stayed married if I hadn't let my lust. After giving everything careful thought, I realized I'd made a mistake. I'd wronged Dave, so I decided to go see him and apologize properly for the pain I'd caused him. When I arrived at the house, I met new faces. When I inquired about what was happening, they told me they were the new owners of the house. Apparently, Dave had sold the house. I tried to get in touch with Dave to tell him I was sorry, but the security team said he'd moved to another city. I called his other number a few times, but there was no answer. I went to his parents' house to ask for his new contact details and to try to persuade them to speak to him on my behalf. When I got there, I was met by Dave's mom, who was not at all welcoming. She wouldn't let me in and started hurling insults at me. She even called me a gold digger and said I'd ruined her son's life. She said she'd never liked me and had been worried about me from the start. She made it clear that she said, I was happy that Dave listened to his mom's advice about signing a prenup before our wedding. She said she was glad that I was now back in the SL where I belong. I was taken aback by everything she was saying. I told her I was sorry and asked her to please forgive me and give me Dave's contact details. She told me that would never happen and that it would be over her dead body. I left the place as quickly as I could to avoid any trouble, but I still wanted to speak to Dave the next day. I met with Dave's childhood friend and asked him to please help me with Dave's new contact. He refused at first, but after a lot of persuasion, he gave me Dave's new contact details. After calling Dave several times without any response, I decided to go visit him in Los Angeles. I drove all the way from California to Los Angeles. I know it sounds crazy, but I was desperate. I had a feeling that Dave would forgive me and that we could start all over again when I finally apologized for how I had wronged him. I soon arrived at the residence and was surprised. I knew Dave was wealthy, but buying a house in a gated community was another level of wealth. I rang the doorbell, and a lady opened the door for me. When I asked who she was, she introduced herself as Dave's girlfriend. As we were still talking, Dave arrived. He looked angry. If I hadn't gone to see him, I'd probably be dead by now. He was really angry when he saw me. He asked me how I got his home address, and just as I was about to open my mouth, he pushed me out of his house. He warned me to stop spamming his phone with calls and messages, and that he has moved on. I told him I only wanted to apologize for how things ended between us. At that point, he looked me in the face and told me he would never forgive me and that I should get lost. I was really embarrassed. I left there with my head bowed on the ground. On my way back home that day, I cried. I couldn't believe how quickly Dave moved on. It was just 6 months after our divorce, and he already had a new girlfriend. The worst part was that the lady was pregnant. Maybe I was wrong about everything. Maybe Dave never really loved me as he said, because if he did, he wouldn't have moved on so quickly. Honestly, I felt betrayed. That's my story, guys. Everything still feels like a dream, and I hope that I will wake up from this horrible nightmare one day.